It was pouring rain on a desolate stretch of Interstate 80 when a 7-year-old boy in a faded yellow raincoat tapped on the tinted glass of a stalled $2 million Ferrari SF90. Inside sat Lorenzo Moretti, head of the East Coast's most ruthless crime syndicate, gripping a loaded Glock 19, convinced it was an ambush. Instead, the window rolled down to reveal a gap-toothed kid pointing a tiny finger at the smoking engine vent. "My mom can fix it," the boy said, completely unfazed by the cold steel resting on Lorenzo's lap. He had no idea he had just invited a monster into their lives. The storm had rolled into the Pennsylvania valleys with unexpected violence, turning the winding asphalt into a slick, treacherous mirror. Lorenzo Moretti cursed in breathless Italian, slamming his palm against the leather-wrapped steering wheel of his pristine, jet-black Ferrari. The hybrid engine, an engineering marvel that had cost him more than a suburban mansion, had sputtered, choked, and died in the middle of nowhere. Smoke, thick and acrid, hissed into the torrential rain from the rear engine bay. Lorenzo was not a man who waited. He was a man who dictated terms. At 34, he ruled the Moretti family with an iron fist and a calculated coldness that terrified even the hardened capos of New York. Tonight, he was supposed to be halfway to Chicago to negotiate a ceasefire with the rival Russo outfit. His security detail was trailing 20 miles behind due to a multi-car pileup he had barely maneuvered around. Now, he was a sitting duck. He checked the magazine of his Glock 19, snapping it back into the grip with a sharp, metallic click. The silence of the dead car was deafening, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain. If the Russos found him here, it would be a massacre. A sudden tap-tap-tap on the passenger side window made his blood run cold. Lorenzo leveled the gun beneath the dashboard, his dark eyes narrowing as he turned his head. Through the rain-streaked glass, he didn't see the barrel of an assault rifle or the masked face of a hitman. He saw a bright yellow rain hood framing a pale, freckled face. Cautiously, Lorenzo pressed the auxiliary power button. The window glided down a mere 2 inches. Cold wind and water whipped into the luxurious cabin. "You can't park here," a small voice piped up. Lorenzo blinked, loosening his grip on the firearm just a fraction. It was a boy, no older than 7, clutching a half-eaten granola bar. "Get lost, kid," Lorenzo barked, his voice a low, gravelly threat. "Before you get hurt." The boy didn't flinch. He leaned closer to the gap in the window, his blue eyes scanning the expensive interior before settling on the wisps of smoke rising from the back. "Your car is broken. It smells like burnt plastic." "I am aware," Lorenzo growled, checking his Rolex. His men were still 15 minutes out, assuming the roads were clear. "Where are your parents?" The boy pointed a sticky finger over his shoulder. Through the blinding rain, Lorenzo could barely make out the flashing amber lights of an old, rusted flatbed tow truck pulled over on the muddy shoulder behind him. "My mum can fix it," the boy stated with absolute, unshakable confidence. "She fixes everything." Before Lorenzo could dismiss the child, a figure emerged from the deluge. She was clad in heavy, oil-stained canvas coveralls, a drenched baseball cap pulled low over her face. She jogged toward the Ferrari, her boots splashing heavily in the puddles. "Leo!" the woman shouted, her voice cutting through the storm. "Get back in the truck right now!" She reached the boy, grabbing him by the shoulders and ushering him back. Then she turned her attention to the Ferrari. Lorenzo watched her through the glass. She wasn't what he expected. Strands of wet, auburn hair clung to her cheeks. She had a smudge of dark grease across her jawline, and her eyes, a striking, piercing green, were sharp and unyielding as she peered into his window. "Look, buddy," she said loudly, assuming he couldn't hear well over the rain. "You're in a blind spot on a slick curve. You're going to get rear-ended by a semi if you sit here. Pop the hood, or, well, the trunk." Lorenzo didn't move. "I don't need a tow. My people are coming." "Your people aren't going to get past the jackknifed rig at mile marker 112, she retorted, crossing her arms. The rain pelted her, but she stood her ground. "The state troopers just closed the interstate behind us. You're stuck with me, pal. I'm Sarah. This is Hayes Towing and Repair. Now, are you going to let me winch this glorified go-kart onto my bed, or do you want to die in it?" Lorenzo's jaw tightened. No one spoke to him like that. Yet, the mention of the closed interstate changed his calculus. If the road was closed, his backup wasn't coming. And if his backup wasn't coming, he was entirely vulnerable. He slipped the Glock into the inner pocket of his tailored Tom Ford jacket and pushed the door open, stepping out into the freezing downpour. He towered over her, a menacing, broad-shouldered silhouette in the storm. "Do not scratch the paint," Lorenzo said, his voice deadly quiet. Sarah met his gaze, completely unbothered by the intimidation radiating from him. "I'll try not to breathe on it too hard. Go sit in my cab. It's warm. Leo won't bite." Lorenzo Moretti, a man who commanded hundreds of armed soldiers, found himself trudging through the mud toward a beat-up 1998 Ford F350 flatbed. He climbed into the passenger seat, immediately assaulted by the smell of cheap vanilla air freshener, stale coffee, and motor oil. Leo was buckled into the middle seat, swinging his legs. He looked up at Lorenzo. "I told you she could fix it." "We will see," Lorenzo muttered, wiping water from his face as he watched Sarah skillfully maneuver the heavy chains and winch controls in the driving rain. She worked with a brutal, practiced efficiency, securing the delicate undercarriage of the SF-90 without a single misstep. As she finally climbed into the driver's seat, bringing a rush of cold air and the scent of rain with her, she threw the truck into gear. "Where are we going?" Lorenzo asked, his hand instinctively resting over the concealed weapon in his jacket. "My shop. About 10 miles off the exit," Sarah said, keeping her eyes on the treacherous road. "It's not the Ritz, but it's dry. We'll see what you fried in that engine." Lorenzo watched her profile illuminated by the dashboard lights. She was a mechanic in the middle of nowhere, yet there was a tension in her shoulders, a constant scanning of the mirrors that he recognized instantly. It was the body language of someone who was used to looking over her shoulder. "What's your name?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. "Lorenzo." "Well, Lorenzo," she sighed, downshifting as they exited the highway into the dark, forested foothills. "Welcome to Hayes Auto. Let's hope your wallet is as big as your ego." The garage was a cavernous, corrugated steel building tucked away at the end of a long, unmarked gravel driveway. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed with a low, irritable buzz, casting a harsh glare over concrete floors stained deeply with years of spilled fluids. Tools were meticulously organized on pegboards, a stark contrast to the chaotic exterior of the shop. Sarah backed the flatbed in, the heavy diesel engine echoing off the metal walls before dying with a final, rattling cough. "Home sweet home," Sarah muttered, unbuckling her seatbelt. She turned to Leo. "Upstairs, kiddo. Homework. Then you can watch a movie." Leo grabbed his backpack and scrambled out, giving Lorenzo one last curious look before darting up a set of wooden stairs that led to a loft apartment overlooking the garage floor. Lorenzo stepped out of the truck, fastidiously shaking the rainwater from his jacket. He surveyed the space. It was isolated, defensible, but there was only one exit, and he didn't like being boxed in. He pulled out his phone. No signal. "Dead zone," Sarah said, noticing his frustration. She walked over to a heavy control box and hit a button. With a mechanical groan, the massive bay doors rolled down, sealing them inside. Nearest cell tower is on the other side of the ridge. I have a landline in the office if you need to call your people. That won't be necessary right now, Lorenzo lied smoothly. He couldn't risk calling his lieutenants on an unsecure line. If there was a rat in his crew, a traced landline call would lead the Russos straight to this garage. Sarah shrugged, grabbing a heavy-duty flashlight and a diagnostic tablet. She began the meticulous process of lowering the Ferrari off the flatbed and positioning it over a hydraulic lift. Lorenzo watched her work. She peeled off her soaked canvas coveralls, revealing a faded grey t-shirt and grease-stained jeans. Her movements were fluid and strong. He was used to women who wore designer gowns and draped themselves over him for his power and wealth. Sarah treated him like he was nothing more than an annoyance, another job on a Tuesday night. "It's an electrical failsafe," Sarah diagnosed aloud, peering into the exposed rear engine bay, her flashlight beam dancing over the complex wiring. "Your cooling system took a hit. Look here." She pointed. A piece of road debris kicked up, sheared the auxiliary coolant line. The engine computer sensed the sudden temperature spike and killed the ignition to prevent the block from melting. "Can you bypass it?" Lorenzo demanded, pacing the floor. "I'm a mechanic, Lorenzo, not a wizard. This is a proprietary Maranello computer system. You can't just hot-wire it." She wiped her hands on a rag, staring at the engine. "But I might be able to patch the line, refill the coolant, and use a scanner I have to clear the hard codes. It might trick the ECU into thinking the crisis is averted, at least long enough to get you to a proper dealership." "Do it," he commanded. Sarah raised an eyebrow, tossing the rag onto a workbench. "I charge $200 an hour for after-hours emergencies, plus parts." Lorenzo reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick money clip, and tossed a stack of crisp $100 bills onto the hood of a nearby rusted sedan. "Just get it running." She didn't immediately lunge for the cash, which surprised him. She merely glanced at it, nodded, and slid under the rear of the Ferrari on a creeper. An hour passed. The only sounds were the clinking of metal tools, the pouring rain outside, and the muffled sound of a cartoon playing from Leo's loft upstairs. Lorenzo paced, his anxiety mounting. The isolation was maddening. He felt blind. He walked over to a dirty window, peering through the rain. Nothing but dark pines. "Hey!" Sarah called out from under the car. Her voice was strained. "I need you to hand me the 10mm socket. On the red cart. Second drawer." Lorenzo hesitated, then walked over. He found the small metal socket and crouched down, extending his hand under the chassis. Sarah reached up to take it. As her fingers brushed against his, she paused. Lorenzo looked down. From his angle, he could see her face, illuminated by the harsh work-light. She wasn't looking at the tool. She was staring intently at a small, black, magnetic box attached to the inner lip of the wheel well. "Did you put this here?" she asked, her voice suddenly tight. "Put what?" Lorenzo leaned down further. Sarah shimmied out from under the car, holding the small black box in her grease-covered palm. It had a tiny, blinking red light on the side. Lorenzo's blood froze. It was a military-grade GPS tracker. "Where did you find that?" Lorenzo asked, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. He snatched the device from her hand. "Tucked behind the sway bar," Sarah said, stepping back, her instincts flaring. She saw the change in his eyes. The arrogant businessman had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating killer. "Lorenzo, who is looking for you?" Before he could answer, the heavy landline phone in the small glass-walled office began to ring. It cut through the silence of the garage like a siren. Both of them stared at it. Nobody called Hayes Auto at midnight in a storm. "Don't answer it," Lorenzo ordered, his hand slipping inside his jacket, wrapping around the grip of his Glock. Sarah looked from the blinking tracker in his hand to the ringing phone. Her maternal panic spiked. Leo was upstairs. "It could be a customer," she lied, her voice trembling slightly. "It is not a customer." Lorenzo stepped between her and the office. "The people who put this tracker on my car just realized the signal stopped moving. They called the nearest business to confirm the location." The phone rang a 5th time, then a 6th. Then it went silent. A heartbeat later, the distinct, heavy crunch of tires rolling over the gravel driveway echoed through the steel walls of the garage. It wasn't one vehicle. It sounded like 3 heavy SUVs. Sarah's eyes widened in sheer terror. She looked up at the loft where her son was sitting. "They're here," Lorenzo whispered, pulling the Glock 19 free and racking the slide. "Do exactly what I say, Sarah, or we both die tonight." The heavy crunch of tires rolling over the wet gravel driveway echoed like thunder through the corrugated steel walls of the garage. It wasn't one vehicle. The synchronized rumble of high-displacement engines suggested at least 3 heavy SUVs. Through the frosted, dirt-caked windows of the roll-up bay doors, the blinding white beams of LED headlights sliced through the darkness, casting long, distorted shadows across the concrete floor. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. The grease rag slipped from her trembling fingers, landing with a soft slap in a puddle of spilled antifreeze. Her eyes darted upward, fixing instantly on the wooden staircase leading to the loft. "Leo." "They're here," Lorenzo whispered. His voice was completely devoid of panic, replaced by a chilling, mechanical calm. He pulled his Glock 19 free from his tailored Tom Ford jacket, his thumb expertly sweeping the safety off. He racked the slide, chambering a 9mm hollow point round with a sharp, metallic clack. "Do exactly what I say, Sarah, or we both die tonight." "My son is up there," Sarah gasped, her maternal instincts violently overriding her fear. She took a step toward the stairs, but Lorenzo's heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder like a vice, stopping her dead in her tracks. "If you run up those stairs, you will draw their fire directly to him," Lorenzo stated, his dark eyes locked on the reinforced steel man door at the side of the building. "They are going to breach. We need to create a fatal funnel. What is behind that door?" "The alleyway," Sarah stammered, forcing herself to focus. She could hear the heavy thud of combat boots hitting the muddy ground outside, just old tires and the dumpster. "Good. They will come through the front office and the side door simultaneously," Lorenzo calculated, moving with predatory grace behind the rusted chassis of a 1980 Ford Bronco sitting on jack stands. "Get behind the engine block. Now." "I am not leaving Leo," Sarah hissed fiercely, ripping her shoulder from his grasp. Before Lorenzo could argue, the glass of the front office shattered inward with a deafening crash. A heavy tactical baton had smashed through the pane, followed instantly by the muzzle of a suppressed submachine gun. "Move!" Lorenzo roared, abandoning stealth. He shoved Sarah hard behind the solid cast-iron engine block of the Bronco, just as a 3-round burst of suppressed gunfire chipped the concrete where she had been standing seconds before. The garage erupted into chaos. The heavy steel side door groaned under the impact of a breaching ram. On the second hit, the frame splintered, and the door flew inward. 3 men clad in black tactical gear and Kevlar vests swarmed into the garage, their weapons sweeping the dark corners. Lorenzo didn't hesitate. He rose smoothly from behind the Bronco, his arm extended. He didn't fire wildly. He fired with the precise, practiced rhythm of a man who had killed before. Pop, pop. The lead breacher staggered backward, 2 rounds sent a mass, stopping him dead despite the Kevlar armor, the sheer kinetic force knocking the wind from his lungs. "Take cover! He's armed!" one of the attackers shouted in harsh, accented English. Sarah crouched in the grease and dirt, her hands clamped over her ears as the deafening roar of gunfire filled her sanctuary. She looked at Lorenzo. The arrogant, wealthy businessman in the broken Ferrari was gone. In his place was a soldier, cold and terrifyingly efficient. But he was outgunned. More men were pouring through the shattered office window, taking cover behind the customer cars waiting for repairs. "Lorenzo!" A voice boomed over the gunfire. It was echoing from the front office. The voice was deep, resonant, and entirely familiar to Lorenzo. "Put the weapon down, boss. You're completely surrounded. It doesn't have to end messy." Lorenzo's blood turned to ice. He ducked back behind the Bronco as a hail of bullets shredded a nearby tool chest, sending sockets and wrenches flying like shrapnel. He knew that voice. It wasn't the Russos. "Matteo!" Lorenzo spat the name out like poison. Matteo was his capo regime, his right-hand man, the man he had trusted to secure his route to Chicago. The GPS tracker suddenly made perfect, sickening sense. This wasn't a hit by a rival family. This was a coup from within his own ranks. "Times are changing, Lorenzo," Matteo called out, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "The family needs new leadership. The Russos made us an offer we couldn't refuse. Surrender, and I promise I'll make it quick." "You piece of garbage," Lorenzo growled to himself, quickly dropping the spent magazine from his Glock and slapping a fresh one into the grip. He had 15 rounds left. There were at least 8 men in the garage. Sarah, realizing that Lorenzo was pinned down and her son was trapped upstairs, knew she had to act. She wasn't a mobster, but she knew this garage better than she knew the back of her own hand. Her eyes darted to the large, red, industrial acetylene tanks chained to the structural pillar near the side door where the men were currently clustered. "Lorenzo," Sarah whispered urgently, crawling closer to him. "Do you see those red tanks by the pillar?" Lorenzo glanced over, dodging a ricochet. "Acetylene. Highly explosive. I shoot them, we all blow up." "Not if you just shoot the valve off the top," Sarah said, her voice shaking, but her eyes burning with an intense, desperate fire. "It's pressurized at 250 psi. If the valve shears off, that tank turns into a 200-pound unguided missile. It'll rip through them." Lorenzo looked at the mechanic. He saw the grease on her cheek and the sheer terror in her eyes. But he also saw a razor-sharp mind calculating the physics of their survival. He nodded once. "When it goes, you run for the stairs. Get your boy," Lorenzo ordered. Lorenzo took a deep breath, visualizing the angle. He popped up from cover, ignoring the immediate suppression fire from Matteo's men. He aimed not at the men, but at the brass valve assembly atop the heavy red cylinder. He fired twice. The first shot missed, sparking off the heavy steel rim. The second shot hit dead center. The brass valve sheared clean off. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. With a deafening, high-pitched scream of escaping pressurized gas, the massive acetylene tank launched itself from its chains. It didn't explode. It became a kinetic torpedo. It slammed violently into the group of tactical gunmen by the side door, shattering kneecaps and throwing 2 men into the brick wall with bone-crunching force. The sheer volume of hissing gas disoriented the rest, filling that side of the garage with a blinding white cloud and a deafening roar. "Go!" Lorenzo yelled. Sarah didn't hesitate. She scrambled from behind the Bronco and sprinted across the open floor, her boots slipping on the oil-slicked concrete. Gunfire erupted behind her, but Lorenzo was laying down a ruthless curtain of suppressing fire, forcing Matteo's men to keep their heads down. Sarah hit the wooden stairs at a dead sprint, taking them 2 at a time. She burst into the loft apartment. Leo was huddled under the kitchen table, his hands over his ears, his face pale with terror. "Leo! Come here, baby, come here!" Sarah cried, sliding to her knees and dragging him out. She wrapped him tightly in her arms, feeling his small heart hammering against her chest. "Mum, what's happening? Are those fireworks?" Leo sobbed, burying his face in her shoulder. "It's just a bad storm, sweetie. We have to leave, right now," Sarah lied, hoisting the 7-year-old onto her hip. She grabbed a heavy steel wrench from the kitchen counter, her only weapon, and moved back to the top of the stairs. Down below, the hissing of the tank was dying down. Lorenzo was pinned behind a heavy industrial tire balancer, trading shots with Matteo, who was now advancing cautiously from the office. Lorenzo was bleeding. A bullet had grazed his left bicep, staining the sleeve of his expensive jacket, a dark, wet crimson. "Sarah!" Lorenzo shouted over the din, spotting her at the top of the stairs. "The Ferrari is dead. We need a vehicle. Now!" Sarah scanned the garage. The bay doors were closed, but there was one car parked in the rear detailing bay, facing the secondary, old wooden roll-up door at the back of the shop. It was a customer's car, recently finished. A meticulously restored, midnight blue, 1969 Chevrolet Chevelle SS with a 454 big block V8. The keys were in the ignition. "The Chevelle, in the back bay," Sarah yelled, pointing. "It's fueled up and ready." "Get in the driver's seat and start it," Lorenzo commanded. "I will cover you." Sarah tightened her grip on Leo. "Hold on tight, monkey. Close your eyes." She dashed down the stairs, using the heavy steel beams of the loft support for cover. Bullets pinged against the metal around them, showering them with sparks and concrete dust. Lorenzo stepped out from behind the tire balancer, exposing himself to draw their fire. He fired 3 rapid shots toward Matteo's position, forcing the traitor to duck behind the ruined Ferrari. Sarah reached the midnight blue Chevelle. She practically threw Leo into the back seat, shouting for him to stay on the floorboards. She vaulted into the driver's seat, her grease-stained hands gripping the immaculate wooden steering wheel. She reached for the ignition, twisted the key, and pumped the gas pedal twice. The 454 cubic inch V8 roared to life with a guttural, ground-shaking bellow that vibrated in her chest. It was a beautiful, violent sound, a mechanical beast waking up in the middle of a war zone. Lorenzo sprinted toward the car, firing his last 2 rounds backward before sliding over the hood like a shadow and dropping into the passenger seat. He slammed the door shut. "Drive!" Lorenzo roared, wincing as he clutched his bleeding arm. "The door is closed!" Sarah yelled back over the roar of the engine, pointing at the heavy wooden rear bay door. "I said drive!" Sarah didn't think twice. She threw the heavy Hurst shifter into first gear, dumped the clutch, and slammed her foot on the accelerator. The Chevelle's massive rear tires spun wildly on the smooth concrete, shrieking in protest before finally finding traction. The classic muscle car launched forward like a cannonball. It slammed into the wooden bay door at 40 miles an hour. The aging wood splintered and exploded outward in a shower of debris, launching the Chevelle out into the torrential rain and the muddy backlot of the property. Sarah fought the steering wheel as the car fishtailed wildly in the mud. She slammed through a rusted chain-link fence, the metal scraping violently against the flawless midnight blue paint job, a detail that would have made her weep on any other day. She merged onto the narrow, unlit back road behind her shop, shifting into second gear and accelerating hard into the stormy darkness. Behind them, the headlights of 3 black Cadillac Escalades smashed through the ruins of the back bay door, their massive tires tearing up the mud as they gave chase. "They're coming!" Sarah screamed, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The blinding lights were closing in fast. "Keep your foot down," Lorenzo ordered, his voice strained through clenched teeth. He reached into his jacket with his good hand, pulling out a spare magazine and reloading his Glock with practiced, one-handed efficiency against his leg. "Do you know these roads?" "I grew up on them," Sarah said, her knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. She downshifted as a sharp, blind curve approached, throwing the heavy Chevelle into a controlled drift. The rear end slid out, the tires screaming against the wet asphalt, but she caught it perfectly, rocketing out of the apex. Lorenzo looked at her, genuinely surprised. The mechanic handled the raw, unassisted horsepower of the classic muscle car with the skill of a professional getaway driver. "Take a left at the next fork," Lorenzo instructed, glancing at the GPS on his phone, which had finally picked up a faint signal. "No," Sarah snapped, accelerating past 100 miles an hour on the narrow 2-lane road. The rain was lashing against the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. "That takes us back to Interstate 80. The state troopers have it locked down, and if Matteo has scanners, they'll box us in at the toll booths." "I am giving the orders here," Lorenzo barked, gripping the door handle as the car caught air over a blind crest. "You brought a hit squad to my home," Sarah yelled back, her fury finally boiling over her fear. "You put my son in danger. So right now, you are sitting in my customer's car, and you are going to let me drive, or I will pull the handbrake and let Matteo have you." Lorenzo stared at her in the dim dashboard light. He was the boss of the Moretti family. Men had been executed for simply looking at him with disrespect. Yet, sitting beside this furious, grease-stained mother, tearing through the Pennsylvania backwoods, he found himself completely stripped of his usual authority. "Fine," Lorenzo conceded quietly, pressing his hand harder against his bleeding bicep. "Where are we going?" "There's an old logging road about 3 miles up," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on the treacherous road ahead. "It cuts through the state game lands and dumps out near an abandoned mining facility. The Escalades are too heavy and wide. They'll get bogged down in the mud. The Chevelle is lighter. If we can make it to the mine, we can hide the car in the maintenance tunnels." "Mum?" A tiny, trembling voice came from the back seat. Sarah's heart broke. She glanced in the rearview mirror. Leo was peeking up over the leather seat, his eyes wide with unspeakable fear, still clutching the heavy steel wrench she had given him. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here," Sarah said, her voice instantly softening, losing all the venom she had just directed at Lorenzo. "Keep your head down, okay? We're playing a game of hide and seek." Lorenzo turned awkwardly in his seat to look at the boy. He had lived in a world of violence and betrayal his entire life. Children were an abstract concept, usually kept far away in heavily guarded private schools. Seeing the sheer terror in the kids' eyes, terror that Lorenzo had directly caused by bringing a tracker into their lives, stirred something deeply uncomfortable in his chest. Guilt. It was an emotion Lorenzo Moretti rarely, if ever, allowed himself to feel. "You did good, kid," Lorenzo said, his gravelly voice surprisingly gentle. He pointed to the wrench in Leo's hands. "You hold on to that. You're the muscle back there." Leo blinked, looking at the intimidating, bleeding man in the front seat, then down at his wrench. He slowly nodded and ducked back down out of sight. "Turn here!" Sarah suddenly shouted. She slammed on the brakes, the Chevelle skidding wildly as she wrenched the steering wheel to the right. The car dove off the paved road and plunged onto a severely rutted, overgrown dirt trail. Branches whipped violently against the windshield and sides of the car. The suspension bottomed out with a sickening crunch, but Sarah kept her foot on the gas, forcing the heavy V8 engine to plow through the deep mud and underbrush. Seconds later, the lead Cadillac Escalade flew past the hidden turnoff on the main road, its sirens blaring, completely missing their detour. Sarah drove for another 10 minutes deep into the dark, dense forest, the road worsening with every mile. Finally, the trees opened up to reveal the massive, rusting skeleton of an abandoned coal breaker facility looming against the stormy night sky. It looked like a haunted steel fortress. She navigated the Chevelle through a pair of rusted, open gates and drove straight into the gaping maw of an old equipment tunnel beneath the main processing building. She cut the engine and killed the headlights. Total darkness and silence instantly swallowed them, save for the pinging of the hot engine block cooling down and the distant, muffled sound of the rain. Sarah rested her forehead against the steering wheel, her breath coming in ragged, exhausting gasps. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, crushing wave of reality. Her garage was likely destroyed. Her life was upended. She was sitting in a stolen classic car with a bleeding Mafia boss. "Are you hit?" Lorenzo asked quietly into the darkness. "No," Sarah whispered, wiping a mixture of sweat and tears from her face. She turned to the back seat. "Leo, are you okay, honey?" Leo popped his head up, his small hands still gripping the wrench. "I'm okay, Mom." Sarah let out a shaky breath and turned to look at Lorenzo. In the faint, ambient light filtering in from the tunnel entrance, she could see the dark stain spreading across his jacket. He was pale, leaning heavily against the passenger door. "You're bleeding badly," Sarah noted, her mechanic's brain automatically shifting to triage mode. A broken machine was a broken machine, whether it was a Ferrari or a mob boss. "It's a through and through," Lorenzo grunted, trying to mask the pain. "Matteo's men use full metal jackets. It missed the bone." "We need to stop the bleeding, or you're going to go into shock," Sarah said, unbuckling her seatbelt. She reached into the center console and pulled out a small, emergency first aid kit she always kept in customer cars she test drove. "Take the jacket off." Lorenzo hesitated. Removing his jacket meant fully disarming himself and exposing his vulnerability to a stranger, but he looked at the fiercely competent woman sitting next to him. She had just saved his life, outdriven his assassins, and hadn't panicked once. Slowly, agonizingly, Lorenzo peeled the ruined Tom Ford jacket off his shoulders, exposing a crisp white dress shirt that was now soaked in dark red blood. "So," Sarah said, ripping open a sterile gauze pad as she leaned over the center console toward him, her green eyes locking onto his dark ones. "Since you just got my business shot to pieces, you want to tell me exactly who the hell you are, Lorenzo." The interior of the 1969 Chevelle was pitch black, save for the faint, silvery moonlight slicing through the rusted grates of the abandoned coal breaker's tunnel. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, unburned high-octane fuel, and the sharp metallic tang of fresh blood. Sarah ripped open a sterile gauze pad with her teeth, spitting the wrapper onto the floorboards. She pressed the pad firmly against the bullet hole in Lorenzo's left bicep. He inhaled sharply through his teeth, his jaw muscles clenching, but he didn't pull away. "Keep pressure on it," Sarah ordered, her voice a hushed, ragged whisper. She grabbed a roll of medical tape, her grease-stained fingers working with frantic precision. "Who are you, Lorenzo? Because normal businessmen don't have tactical hit squads blowing up my auto shop with suppressed submachine guns." Lorenzo looked at her. Her face was inches from his, illuminated only by the ambient shadows. He could see a smudge of oil across her cheekbone, mixing with a stray tear she hadn't bothered to wipe away. He was accustomed to women who panicked at the sight of a broken nail, let alone a gunshot wound. Yet here was a single mother, hand steady despite the tremor in her voice, patching him up in a stolen muscle car. "My name is Lorenzo Moretti," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. "I control the Moretti Syndicate. We operate out of New York. The shipping lanes in the port of Newark, the private sanitation contracts in the 5 boroughs, the new real estate developments in Hudson Yards. They all run through me." Sarah's hands froze on the medical tape. The Moretti family. She didn't read the tabloids often, but anyone living on the East Coast had heard whispers of the Morettis. They were practically royalty in the underworld, ruthless, untouchable, and notoriously violent. "A mob boss," Sarah breathed, staring at him in disbelief. "You're a mob boss, and I just brought you into my home." "You towed a stranded motorist," Lorenzo corrected her softly. "I didn't plan for Matteo to find me. Matteo is my caporegime, my second in command." "So why is he trying to kill you?" Sarah demanded, finally tearing the tape and securing the heavy bandage around his arm. "Because power is a disease, Sarah," Lorenzo said, leaning his head back against the leather headrest, his breathing shallow. "I was on my way to Chicago to negotiate a peace treaty with the Russo family. It's a rival outfit. Matteo didn't want peace. He wanted a hostile takeover. The Russos likely promised him my seat at the head of the table if he eliminated me on the road. That GPS tracker you found, Matteo planted it before I left Manhattan." "Mom?" Sarah flinched, turning around. Leo was curled up on the back seat, his head resting on his backpack, the heavy steel wrench still tightly gripped in his small hands. His eyelids were drooping, heavy with exhaustion and the emotional crash that follows sheer terror. "I'm right here, Leo," she whispered, reaching back to stroke his hair. "Try to get some sleep. We're safe here for a little while." "Is the bad man going to die?" Leo asked, his voice barely a squeak, pointing a tiny finger at Lorenzo. Lorenzo turned his head, looking at the boy. The coldness that usually resided in his dark eyes softened just a fraction. "No, kid, I'm not going to die. Your mum is a very good mechanic. She fixed me right up." Leo blinked sleepily, seemingly satisfied with that answer, and closed his eyes. Within minutes, the soft, rhythmic sound of his breathing filled the quiet car. Sarah turned back to Lorenzo, her expression hardening. He is 7 years old. He shouldn't have to ask if someone is going to bleed to death in the front seat. "I know," Lorenzo said. It was a simple statement, but it carried a weight of genuine remorse that surprised even him. "I will compensate you for the garage, for the Chevelle, for everything." "I don't want your blood money," Sarah snapped bitterly. "I want my life back. I want to wake up tomorrow, make pancakes, and argue with a supplier about the price of brake pads. Instead, I'm hiding in a collapsed mine with a Mafia don." Lorenzo reached out with his good right arm, his large, calloused hand gently wrapped around her wrist. The sudden physical contact sent an unexpected jolt through Sarah. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the freezing dampness of the tunnel. "I cannot give you yesterday back," Lorenzo said, holding her gaze with intense sincerity. "But I swear to you on my life, Sarah, Matteo will not touch you or your son. I will tear my own empire to the ground before I let them hurt you." For a long moment, the only sound was the distant drumming of the rain outside the tunnel. Sarah looked into his eyes, searching for a lie, a manipulation, but all she saw was a brutal, unwavering honesty. He was a monster to the rest of the world, but in this dark, cold car, he was swearing to be their shield. Suddenly, a sharp, rhythmic beep shattered the quiet intimacy of the moment. Lorenzo yanked his arm back, his eyes widening in alarm. He rolled up his blood-stained sleeve, exposing a heavy, brushed steel Audemars Piguet Royal Oak watch on his wrist. The digital date complication on the face was flashing an unnatural, bright red. "Damn it!" Lorenzo cursed, frantically unbuckling the luxury timepiece. "I am an idiot." "What is it?" Sarah asked, her pulse spiking again. "It's not just a watch. My security team heavily modified it with an internal biometric transmitter. It monitors my heart rate and location. If my heart stops, it sends a distress signal to my crew," Lorenzo explained, his fingers struggling with the clasp due to his injured arm. "But your heart didn't stop," Sarah said. "No, but my phone did," Lorenzo said grimly. "When I dropped my phone in your garage during the firefight, Matteo's men must have smashed it. The watch is programmed to ping its secondary locator beacon if the primary device is destroyed." He finally got the watch off. He didn't hesitate. Lorenzo opened the passenger door, dropped the $40,000 timepiece onto the concrete, and brought his heavy leather boot down on it with crushing force. The glass shattered, and the metal casing bent, killing the flashing red light instantly. "Did they get a signal?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Long enough to get a general radius," Lorenzo said, pulling the door shut and locking it. He looked out the windshield into the absolute darkness of the tunnel. "They know we didn't get far. They will start sweeping the grid. We need to move before dawn." The pre-dawn air was bitterly cold. The violent storm had finally passed, leaving behind a thick, freezing fog that clung to the rusted steel girders of the abandoned coal mine. Inside the dark tunnel, Sarah gently shook Leo awake. The boy groaned, rubbing his eyes, completely disoriented by the dark leather interior of the Chevelle and the damp, earthy smell of the subterranean facility. "Come on, monkey. Time to wake up," Sarah whispered, handing him a half-crushed granola bar from her pocket. "We have to go for a hike." Lorenzo was already out of the car, his posture stiff. The adrenaline had worn off, and his gunshot wound throbbed with a deep, burning ache. He checked the magazine of his Glock in the dim light. 12 rounds left. "We can't take the car," Lorenzo stated, as Sarah stepped out, hoisting Leo onto her back. "The 454 engine is too loud. It will echo off these canyon walls and ring the dinner bell for Matteo's men. We go on foot through the back of the property toward the state highway. I have a safe house in Scranton. We just need to find a civilian vehicle to hotwire." Sarah looked longingly at the beautiful classic car, but didn't argue. She adjusted Leo's weight and followed Lorenzo into the eerie, silent graveyard of the mining facility. Massive, rusted excavators loomed in the fog like steel dinosaurs. The ground was slick with wet coal dust and mud. Sarah struggled to keep her footing, pushing through the burning in her thighs, driven entirely by pure maternal terror. They had made it halfway across the main processing yard when the distinct, low hum of a high-end V8 engine cut through the quiet morning air. Lorenzo stopped dead. "Get down," he hissed. They ducked behind the massive rusted tracks of an abandoned bulldozer. Through the thick fog, a pair of yellow fog lights slowly pierced the gloom. It was a matte black Jeep Grand Cherokee Trackhawk, moving with predatory slowness down the muddy access road. "A scout," Lorenzo whispered, peering around the steel. "Matteo split his men up to cover more ground. It's just one vehicle." "Can we outrun it to the tree line?" Sarah asked, clutching Leo tighter. "No. They have thermal imaging," Lorenzo said, his jaw tight. "If we break cover, we light up on their dashboard screens like Roman candles. They'll gun us down before we reach the trees." Lorenzo looked at the Glock in his hand. 12 rounds against armored glass and tactical vests was a suicide mission. He looked at Sarah, then at the terrified little boy clinging to her neck. He had made a promise in that car. "Stay here," Lorenzo commanded, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "If I don't come back in 5 minutes, run for the trees and don't look back." Before Sarah could protest, he was gone, slipping into the fog with the silent, lethal grace of a ghost. Sarah huddled against the bulldozer, pressing Leo's face into her shoulder to muffle his frightened whimpers. She listened to the crunch of the Jeep's tires moving closer. Out in the fog, Lorenzo climbed the rusted scaffolding of an old coal chute, ignoring the agonizing, tearing pain in his left arm. He positioned himself directly over the muddy access road. As the jeep rolled slowly beneath him, Lorenzo dropped. He landed heavily on the roof, his boots denting the metal. Inside the cabin, the driver slammed on the brakes in a panic. Before the passenger could react, Lorenzo swung upside down from the roof rack and fired 3 rounds point-blank through the window, killing the hitman instantly. The driver roared in anger, kicking his door open and rolling out into the mud with an assault rifle. Lorenzo dropped from the roof, hitting the ground rolling. He took cover behind the heavy rear tire. "Lorenzo!" the driver shouted. Lorenzo froze. The voice wasn't a nameless thug. It was young, panicked, and devastatingly familiar. "Dominic!" Lorenzo called back, sickened by sudden betrayal. "It's over, cousin!" Dominic yelled, his voice cracking. Dominic was 22. Lorenzo had paid his college tuition, kept him off the violent streets. "Matteo promised me your territory in Queens if I brought him your ring. Just walk out. Please don't make me do this." Lorenzo closed his eyes, a wave of profound sorrow washing over him. The rot in his family was total. They had corrupted his own blood. "I can't do that, Dom," Lorenzo said softly. He didn't pop out from the side. He dropped flat onto his stomach in the mud and aimed underneath the chassis of the jeep. He visualized the angle and pulled the trigger once. The hollow point round ricocheted off the asphalt beneath the mud, fragmenting and tearing upward into Dominic's exposed thigh, severing the femoral artery. Dominic screamed, his rifle clattering away as he collapsed. Lorenzo stood up slowly, walking over to stare down at his bleeding cousin. Dominic was gasping, his hands slick with his own blood. "Lorenzo, please," Dominic choked out. Lorenzo's face was a mask of stone. He kicked the assault rifle away. The bleed would end it in less than a minute. He turned his back on his own flesh and blood and walked away into the fog. When Lorenzo returned to the bulldozer, Sarah let out a choked sob of relief. He was covered in mud, pale, blood seeping through his new bandage. "Are they?" Sarah couldn't finish. "It's clear," Lorenzo said, his voice completely hollow, unable to look her in the eyes. "The jeep is running. We have our ride out." Sarah didn't ask questions. She grabbed Leo's hand and followed the Mafia boss through the fog. As they climbed into the Trackhawk, leaving the ruined coal mine behind, Sarah realized something terrifying. She wasn't just afraid of Lorenzo anymore. She was starting to deeply ache for the broken man beneath the monster. The matte black Trackhawk tore through the fog toward Scranton, its supercharged V8 whining. At the wheel, Sarah kept her foot down, her knuckles white. In the passenger seat, Lorenzo Moretti was fading fast, his makeshift bandage completely soaked through with blood. "Exit 185, Lorenzo murmured, his voice losing its usual gravelly authority. "Keystone Freight. It's a fortified safe house." Following his weak directions, Sarah navigated to a windowless cinder-block warehouse. She punched his code into the rusted keypad, and a massive industrial door rolled up. She drove inside, sealing them within a brilliantly lit, state-of-the-art subterranean garage and armory. Sarah dragged Lorenzo's heavy frame to a stainless steel table. Using a trauma kit he pointed out, she packed his wound with hemostatic combat gauze, the satellite phone in the black case. "The satellite phone in the black case," Lorenzo rasped. "I need to call Silas." He spoke rapidly in Italian. When he lowered the phone, his face was a mask of pure dread. "Matteo isn't in Manhattan. He tracked the Jeep's integrated GPS. Silas intercepted their radio chatter. They are heavily armed and less than 2 minutes away." "The door is reinforced," Lorenzo said, staring at his trembling hands. "But Matteo has breaching charges. Take Leo. There's a ventilation shaft in the back office that leads to the storm drains. Run. I'll detonate the armory when they walk in." Sarah looked around the impeccably equipped garage. Her green eyes flashed with brilliant, desperate ingenuity. "No," Sarah said, her voice dropping into a register of cold certainty. "Leo, hide under the office desk. Now!" She sprinted to a 50-gallon drum of highly flammable engine solvent and knocked it over, letting the volatile chemical pool directly in front of the main steel door. Next, she grabbed heavy-duty jumper cables, clamping one end to the raw output terminals of a massive diesel generator. She dropped the exposed copper clamps on the other end, just half an inch above the solvent puddle. "What are you doing?" Lorenzo asked, stumbling back into the shadows. "Turning the floor into a spark plug," Sarah grunted, her hand resting on the main industrial breaker. "When they breach, they step in the solvent. 240 volts of raw amperage will arc right across it." A deafening clang echoed as C4 charges were attached outside. "Lorenzo!" Matteo's amplified voice bled through the steel. "Come out and I'll let the woman and kid walk." "Come and take my seat, Matteo," Lorenzo roared from the darkness. "Breach!" The explosion shattered every bulb in the ceiling and blew the 2-ton steel door off its hinges. Thick smoke poured in as 5 men in tactical gear rushed blindly through the doorway, their heavy boots splashing directly into the pooled solvent. Sarah threw her entire weight onto the breaker switch. The generator roared. Electricity surged through the cables, arcing with a blinding blue-white flash across the chemical fumes. The front half of the garage erupted into a roaring wall of fire. The 5 gunmen were engulfed instantly, their armor useless against the 1,000-degree inferno, neutralizing the threat in seconds. Matteo, standing just outside the puddle, was violently thrown backward into the mud. Coughing up black smoke, he scrambled away from the flames, utterly stunned. Through the roaring fire, a shadow emerged. Lorenzo stepped forward, pale and blooded, but his eyes were the cold, calculating voids of an apex predator. He raised his Glock 19. "You thought you could outsmart me with an ambush," Lorenzo said, his voice cutting through the crackling flames. "But you forgot one thing. I had a better mechanic." He pulled the trigger twice, ending the coup instantly. Silence descended over the burning garage. Lorenzo lowered his weapon and turned to Sarah, who was pulling a terrified but unharmed Leo from the office. Watching her fierce devotion, Lorenzo realized he didn't want the throne anymore. He wanted peace. 6 months later, the sun shone brightly over Hayes Performance and Restoration, a massive, newly built commercial garage in an affluent upstate New York suburb. Sarah wiped her hands on a clean rag, admiring a flawlessly restored 1969 Chevelle SS. A sleek silver Mercedes pulled into the bay. Lorenzo stepped out, wearing a simple cashmere sweater instead of tactical gear or designer suits. He had dismantled his empire, handing the reins to Silas and transitioning his wealth into legitimate real estate. "How is the new shop running?" Lorenzo asked, a warm smile breaking his stoic face as he looked at the facility he had quietly funded. "It's perfect," Sarah smiled, stepping closer. The fear was gone, replaced by profound respect. "But my lead investor keeps showing up during business hours." "I heard the lead mechanic is worth the distraction," he softly replied, tucking a lock of auburn hair behind her ear. "My mum can fix anything," Leo yelled, riding his bicycle across the shop floor. Lorenzo looked down at the boy, then rested his hand warmly against Sarah's cheek. "I know she can, kid. She fixed me." What an adrenaline-fueled ride. From a stranded Ferrari to an explosive showdown in a secret bunker, Sarah and Lorenzo proved that the most unlikely alliances are the most powerful. Lorenzo came into Sarah's life as a ruthless mob boss, but her fierce mechanical genius and undeniable maternal love dismantled his armor, giving him the courage to leave his dark empire behind. It's a beautiful reminder that sometimes the most broken things and people just need the right hands to fix them. Did Sarah's ingenious trap leave you speechless? If you loved this intense Mafia romance, hit that like button and share the video. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another heart-pounding story. Drop a comment below. Would you have risked it all to fix Lorenzo's car?